Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Josh Rogers. I'm the host of Online with an Architect, and today we're here with Dwayne Lesner from Nutanix. Welcome, Dwayne.
Hey, Josh. Thanks for having me.
Great for you to be here. So today we're going to be talking to Dwayne about all things about the hypervisor and hyperscaler model. Dwayne works with Nutanix. Do you want to give us a quick intro on what you're doing at the moment with Nutanix?
Yeah, currently I'm in technical marketing for NC2, which is our Nutanix Cloud Clusters, which is just that, running our software stack in the cloud. I think prior to coming to Nutanix, I think I was more of a VDI jockey, but as the company's grown, I like to think so. I've done a little bit, and so that's kind of where life has taken me. I do a lot more cloud and networking than I've ever done before.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, definitely networking is the key to the cloud, I think. So that's great. So Nutanix, HCI solution originally. I worked for Nutanix for a long time, and now really moving into that hyperscaler space, which I think is very good and very exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about what a solution in the cloud running a hypervisor is actually doing for a customer?
Well, I think the first part of getting a hypervisor into the cloud probably means that you've had some experience with a hypervisor before, and all of the great things over years that you've loved about virtualization also make sense in the public cloud. I think because there's typically a hyperscaler has their own hypervisor, that you think you'll get a lot of the same benefits, but since they control the keys to their own hypervisor, you actually lose out on a lot of things that would be common to virtualization, as far as like auto adding to your VM or instance types, adding storage on the fly. And not only that, you kind of also lose the performance, which is probably the more costly end of the solution, because in the hyperscaler world, you have compute and storage, and they're typically over the wire. They have millions of customers hitting their infrastructure, and they need to throttle it. And so if you want more performance, you have to pay for it. And when you see customers move into the public cloud, they've never had to deal with it on-prem, because typically you had this subset of smaller VMs and larger VMs together. And as long as the overall storage and the networking were fine, you never had to deal with it. And so you lose some of those abilities when you go into the public cloud.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess for those listening, effectively on the hyperscalers, the hypervisor, the Nutanix hypervisor or the VMware hypervisor is running on top of bare metal. Is that right?
Yeah, I won't speak too much for the VMware side, but yeah, whether it's ESXi or HV, we're running a hypervisor on their bare metal, and which also has its own kind of slew of challenges depending on the hyperscaler that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the benefits you touched on there that customers lose if they're just in the native cloud. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mentioned some of them, but the ability to easily change the VM configuration around CPU and memory, between AWS and Azure, they do it differently. So there's some aspects there. Storage, adding storage, depending on if you need to reboot. I think those are probably the common ones. And then there's other things that you might be typically around snapshotting. Though the cloud has it, there's just different menus and then different costs associated with them.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the things I really like about this type of solution, and working at Nutanix, I was involved with NC2 in the early days. I really like the fact that all the benefits you get with your on-premises virtualization, you effectively get in the cloud, and nothing's really changed. So one of the things that I found interesting was from a cost perspective, that if you compare cloud native instances, they can be quite expensive. And Steve Kaplan, shout out to Steve, did a really good TCO where he compared a native instance versus a virtualized instance on NC2 and showed that there was quite a lot of waste when you size within t-shirt sizes compared to if you can customize the sizing to the workload's requirements. And the thing I found interesting there was we've been talking for a long time in virtualization about right sizing, and you can't really right size in a cloud native environment because you can't control all the aspects. What's your thoughts on that?
When I first heard Steve talk about it, I was kind of like, well, is that really big of a deal? But you you multiply that over 200-300 VMs, it starts to add up. But I think the bigger costly part of that is the storage side, where in the public cloud, say whatever, grab an instance, and the instance is only guaranteed so much performance, baseline performance, and then you also have to match the storage performance. So typically, like say I had a virtual machine or an instance that needed 20,000 IOPS, and I had something that was maybe like in the $500 range or $700 range as an example per month. But in order to get the IOPS, I had to change my instance type, but I also still had to change the storage. Now, provisioned IOPS is expensive, or at least way more than the baseline. But so now typically people will do that, but you can also just buy a lot more capacity. And I think, I'm not really sure what Azure does, but in the AWS side, it's about 3 IOPS per gig. And so you just grab a bunch more storage, but then you're the admin that has to manage the configuration. And so times that by a couple hundred, you leave the company, next guy comes in, or girl, and then like who knows what's going on. So I think that to me was like when the micro-OAS thing really kind of hit home for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other concepts people might not understand is when you run something like Nutanix on premises, you use something like compression or erasure coding, you're getting a lot of capacity savings and your performance is either better, equal or better these days. So when you go to a cloud native instance, you don't really get the benefits of compression. That's the benefit the hyperscaler is getting, enable and giving them a cost advantage to provide you that service. So when you move on to something like NC2 and you can compress and erasure code your data on top of bare metal, I think that's a huge differentiator and a huge value compared to a native instance.
Yeah, it's all built in. And I think to that point too, just, having all of the same day two operations is a big deal, because like, you move to the public cloud, but the thing that no one ever thinks about is like backup as an example. So, there's a lot of other operational challenges that you need to tackle before you head off to your hyperscaler of choice. So there's lots of nuance, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think day two is really critical. So move to the cloud day one, like you say, you've got your instance type there, and then you want to scale it. You're not really sure which instance type and what storage to choose and things like that. It is quite complicated. And I think if we all, take our tech hats off for a minute and assume someone managing it is less skilled and experienced than we are, and they don't know all of these concepts, and it's a huge amount of complexity to scale that person up and enable them as well. So most people are very familiar with Nutanix by this stage. So just deploying that in the cloud seems like a pretty simple solution, which comes back to the value prop in Nutanix originally, which is simplicity.
Yeah, you can spin it up easily and, use your, I think we've had like DR in the project, like I think year 2 or year 3, and I don't know what year we're now, year 12 or 13 or something. But you migrate your workloads there. And I think another thing in the industry that you start to see, or that people are realizing they maybe shouldn't have moved everything into the public cloud. Like there's great spots for public cloud, but there's some things that probably should have been left on-prem. So when those situations arise, you can also easily move it back. There is kind of I see with a couple customers, but I would say more of the marketing scenario where you're moving in between hyperscalers. I think that's kind of like, you'd hold that over there in for negotiations or something, but I don't see it too often. Usually most people just stick with one, at least so far.
Yeah, I think that's a space that's probably going to grow over time. I think most of the products out there, haven't potentially proven that in the market yet, even if they are capable. But yeah, I think in the future that'll be very good risk mitigation to use multiple providers. So if we were to use AWS and Azure natively, to move between the two would be significantly more complicated and take a lot more time than if we're just replicating from Nutanix to Nutanix. That's for sure.
Yeah, like with Nutanix on either side of that end, that's pretty easy. But I think the other, at least from cloud services, once you start to consume a cloud service, you're getting pretty locked in at that point. If you're refactoring an application with like a non-community version, so say of Kubernetes, like you're getting pretty tied in at that point. And it might make perfect sense depending on what you're doing, but the road back is going to be locked and barred, I think, for most of us.
Yeah, I think so. So I mean, some of the value props that the vendors talk about is, you can mix a hyperscaler hypervisor solution with native instances, and they're in the same location. They can talk in a low latency manner and work with each other, which is definitely true. But to your point is, the moment you use the cloud native piece, your mobility out of that cloud becomes restricted, difficult, and almost impossible in some cases. So I think people need to really think about, if they're going to use cloud native, they're going to be somewhat locked in, and it's going to be a significant transition out. So with Nutanix, if we deploy NC2 on Azure today and we need to get out, we've got a cloud exit strategy, our CIOs come to us and said, hey, we need to know how to get out. We need to know how to restore from ransomware. We need to protect ourselves from commercial situations where a hyperscaler might put their price up through the roof. What's that process look like, just at a high level?
If you need to move back to like a private data center, or do you mean like going to another cloud?
Both.
So I guess like step one, probably going back to a private data center. Then as long as you have some Nutanix nodes, which could be HV or ESXi, spin it up, turn on, I guess in the Azure case, both sides would have a Prism Central. You would set up Nutanix DR, set up some protection policies, which are just the RPO, setting up like replication. And then we have recovery plans built into the product where you would then just set up your orchestration, and then kind of you're off to the races. So as fast as you could replicate it out. If by some chance you are moving back to the original data center and have old snapshots around, then you wouldn't have to incur those egress costs. And then the same story for if you're moving from Azure to AWS, you would go into your cloud, your NC2 portal, deploy a cluster in AWS, and kind of just repeat the same process. So it's pretty painless that way. There is tooling too. Nutanix has Nutanix Move, which could actually take some of those instances, whether it's on Nutanix or in the public cloud, and move them around, I guess, where it makes sense.
Yeah, fantastic. Obviously, this is stuff I already know, but for our listeners, I wanted you to explain that in the way that you do. So thank you for that. To me, if we have a customer that has any sort of problem, in fact, so let's say I'm deploying Nutanix, I've deployed NC2, the customer has any problem, whether it's on premises or in a cloud provider, all those tools you mentioned, the replication and Nutanix Move, really does enable them to make a decision on where they want to go and what changes they want to make. So to me, I think that's a great solution. One thing that I talked to John Arazid, who's a VMware employee, VCDX #1, about just recently was, if we have a ransomware hit, that it's very difficult on-prem to recover from ransomware, even if in theory you have a good backup that's not compromised, because the infrastructure itself is compromised and it's very hard to validate that you have resolved all that compromise before restoring a backup. So where do you actually put that backup where you know it's safe? And I think NC2, if you just spin up a net new environment, that is a destination that you know is net new. It's just been stood up from bare metal, and that's a place where you can recover in a timely manner, even if you weren't an NC2 customer at the time of the ransomware hit. Have you seen many customers recover from ransomware or plan their ransomware recovery in that way?
I think it's like a logical stepping stone to get your backups into the public cloud. And so as long as your backups can target HV and then hit an S3 or a blob storage, then it's kind of a perfect landing zone to do such a thing. So and then you don't have to incur the cost of a running cluster. You could, in the case of AWS, you could have one fully configured with your firewall policies already configured, and then we have a feature called Hibernate, where you could just basically put it on pause and just pay the storage costs of the nodes themselves going to S3, and then we would rehydrate the cluster, there wouldn't be much data because it'd be empty, and then once you have it back on, you could just start your backups to that running cluster. Seeing it in bits, but I think still the common use case for Nutanix in the public cloud is DR, migrations, test dev, and good old virtual desktops to rule the world.
The year of the VDI will be coming one day.
Yeah, it's never ending though. The desktops are like the easy use case for the cloud because no one cares about their IP address when it comes to a desktop. So it's simple from that perspective anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So, if we talk about NC2 and the fact that we can have multiple environments, we can recover from ransomware, why are people not doing NC2 more? Is a question I genuinely am not sure about, because to me it's a great solution, it's proven technology. What do you see making people, whether it's a legitimate reason or whether it's a perceived reason, what do you see stopping adoption of a solution like this, which has such great value?
I think, in some parts, a lot of customers have moved to the cloud already and have made a decision. So now it's how do I recoup costs? And that sometimes, or that decision, you will not get a lot of people saying that they've done it wrong if they're in the upper echelons of their hierarchy tree. So that's one. I think just getting comfortable with it too is one way, but I think it's the connecting pieces that have to align in as well. So on the AWS side with native networking, I guess in a lot of ways you're in control of your own networking stack. So you have to be already using a vendor that can fit into that model. There's lots, and then on the Azure side, I think actually the Azure side's, I would say I think there's more in the enterprise space, more Azure. At least that's the feeling that I get when talking to people. That I don't know if they just have these Microsoft credits to burn or what the scoop is, but that seems to be faster. And we haven't had it at the same time as well.
So where would you see, just roughly off the top of your head, the split between Azure and AWS with NC2?
AWS still has more, but it's been around for
a couple of years.
3
right?
years. Yeah, 3 years already. So, but I don't know. It definitely feels like when most of the current customer conversations are in Azure, it seems like. But Azure provides a pretty sweetheart deal. If it runs in Azure, it also inherits all of the long-term support that you get from running in Azure. So that I think has a lot of weight as well, when picking your cloud. So if you have older OSs lying around, which a lot of enterprises do, then you're probably, it's definitely an attractive model.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points that if you look at NC2, it's the same product regardless of the hyperscalers. There's some implementation differences, but largely it's the same. But the differentiating factor may well be the hyperscaler and their value add on top of that service. So the licensing piece and support, is a great example of that. So the thing I really like about the hyperscaler and hypervisor type models is you have that choice to move reasonably easily. So if Microsoft come out with a special and you're on AWS, then you can move. If you've moved to the cloud, as you said, and you're in a native instance and you don't want to admit you're wrong, then, or not necessarily wrong, but there's potentially a better way. I feel like moving on to NC2 within the same the same hyperscaler is not really admitting you're wrong. It's just deploying it in a more efficient way, which will likely deliver more performance, to your point earlier as well.
Yeah, I think, maybe not wrong, but the notion that things do change where we are in technology, and I always laugh at people that have a 5-year plan. Like I'm sure I've made them or had to make them, but things change so fast that you're going to change it before you ever get to your 5th year anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a decision to go with a hyperscaler is a good one. I've seen many customers have great outcomes with the hyperscalers, and to then add a solution like NC2, which is very complementary in my opinion. It takes all the advantage of a hyperscaler, the ability to add nodes quickly, to scale networking, to not have to manage a lot of the infrastructure piece, to then put NC2 on that and get all the benefits of on-prem as well. I love it, actually. I think it's fantastic. And I think more customers should look at it. Now, from a cost perspective, one thing I hear a lot about is people believe that NC2 and competing solutions are very expensive compared to on-prem, or at least this is what I hear a lot. I don't necessarily share that opinion because from an architecture perspective, if someone asks me to design something on-prem for them, I've got to consider the networking piece, the security piece, the compute, the storage, all the other pieces, and then make decisions based around their requirements. And then I have to consider what happens when it runs out of space, how it scales, and choose solutions and configurations that allow them to scale similar to what a hyperscaler can do out of the box. So I would say that the architecture piece on-prem is actually significantly more complicated than in the cloud because you're architecting everything from day one. Whereas in the cloud, you've already got some things done for you. You're architecting around the offering. But to me, it's much easier to architect in the cloud, although the networking piece might be slightly more complicated. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think the cost of really good quality enterprise architecture, which is, of course, what my company provides, is not cheap. It's there for customers who need it. But for smaller customers, I feel like going into NC2 is probably going to be cheaper if you take into account the total cost as opposed to just the monthly or the upfront cost.
Yeah, I would agree that on-prem, if you're doing it right, there are just a ton of variables that you can change and configure, and maybe you're not even doing, I guess, is probably the other factor of it. Versus, having an army of engineers on the hyperscaler side, as far as security goes, and making everything's firewalled off, and the ability to create certain zones of trust within your own environment. That does become a lot easier, and I guess there's a place for everything. I guess it's not really any different than on-prem. As long as you're going to as long as you can justify the cost of a 3 or 4 node cluster on-prem, you should be able to justify the same costs going into the public cloud. If you're doing it for 3 or 4 VMs, then yeah, you could make a pretty good argument going the other way. But if it's relatively in use, yeah, I think because there's costs all over the place on both sides that I think it's easy to sweep under the rug.
Yeah, and on the cost side as well, I've done a lot of comparisons when I was at Nutanix and subsequently, where I looked at customers who were going cloud native or were already cloud native to NC2. And what I found every time was when I did the sizing, obviously we eliminated a lot of that waste that, Steve Kaplan, I think, coined the phrase cloud waste. But we eliminated a lot of that waste by right-sizing VMs and having overcommitment at the hypervisor layer, which you don't really get in the hyperscaler. Obviously, they overcommit, but they get that benefit as opposed to the customer. And then what I found was in the 3, 4, or 6 nodes or whatever the sizing came out with, there was still available resources in that cluster. So if the cost comparison was $1 million cloud native, and it was, even if it was the same, $1 million on NC2, for example, NC2 had capacity to grow without adding cost because there was available CPU and RAM and storage resources. So I think that's another thing that should be considered is if you wanted to spin up some test dev workloads and you're cloud native, you're going to pay for every one of those instances. So whereas on Nutanix, you're just going to clone them and then you're not going to pay anything additional as long as there's some resource left in the cluster, which of course there will be.
So and if you're snapshotting that from the same image, it's not really incurring any storage costs because they've already been paid for once. Because if you're snapshotting on the cloud, there's going to be some costs involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, NC2 and the other solutions, if you're using the snapshotting capabilities, that's one copy of data that you don't really have to pay for, or there's a very minimal cost. Obviously, there's got to be capacity in the cluster, but it's very minimal cost compared to cloud native. And then obviously when you take a second copy, you put it off somewhere else, that's really where you incur your first charge, but that's already your second copy of data at that point. So I think there's a lot of cost saving to be done with these solutions. And to your point about performance, if you've got, especially with the NC2 cluster, if you've got a workload that really needs high performance and you scale out those nodes, that workload is going to improve in performance straight away without re-architecting, without changing instance type, or without doing a single thing because of the distributed nature of AOS. So I think that's a huge benefit. If you have a business critical app, even if you ran 90% of your stuff cloud native and you put just your business critical apps in NC2, I think the performance advantage of doing so would very easily justify that cost, because anything business critical, comes down to it's impacting a large number of users, or it's a critical task that needs to be completed in a timely manner. And the scale out performance, I've blogged about this many times, is very impressive with Nutanix. So, that's something people should consider. If they're having a performance problem with a big database, putting that on NC2 is likely going to resolve that without pretty much any work. So it's a quick and easy outcome.
And it's also, I guess, on the Nutanix side, it's not the wheels falling off the car type of performance. It's HA performance. So it's, if you're moving your database over to the Nutanix side, we're providing some of that, the health and nurture, I guess, as a rack goes down in AWS. At least, there's already the secondary copy somewhere else. It just has to, spin up and reboot, versus if you lose an instance, you may be never seeing that instance again and going to backup to bring it back online. So it's like, how are you going to architect your app on the cloud side, which is probably why app migrations are pretty slow and tedious.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, to your point, like on NC2, you've got the built-in resiliency at the AOS layer and the AHV layer. So you've got all the benefits of virtualization on top of the resiliency the hyperscaler is providing. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So again, on that example on business critical apps, rather than if a rack goes down or there's a physical failure in the hyperscaler, that causing you potentially an outage for an extended period, we're talking about a HA reboot, just like we do on-prem. And I think this is another thing that's probably missed about these offerings is it's a very resilient solution. That's why we deployed virtualization in the first place, 20 years ago and have been doing ever since. And now we've got that in the hyperscaler. So I would argue we've got better resiliency. That's pretty easy to prove. We've got better performance and better performance across, I would say, all workloads within that NC2 cluster, because they're all benefiting from the distributed scale-out system, as opposed to scaling up one instance, one cloud-native instance with a higher tier. So they're all benefiting from it. We've got cost reductions from overcommitment of CPU. I personally don't like overcommitment of memory. That's just a choice I have. Then we've got storage efficiencies. So we've got erasure coding and compression, giving us savings as well, while delivering increased resiliency. So I feel like there's so much value for this solution. I just can't see why they're not more popular today.
Yeah, like even the scheme of why customers are moving, it's still enterprise and it's still long movement cycles and sweating gear. So I think you'll see a lot more in that speed pickup, at least on the Nutanix side, because if you bought something, like, it's got to last typically 4 or 5 years on prem anyway before you're going to sweat the asset, and it might even be more now the way the economy in the world is going. It's like yeah, things aren't too great. It seems like, I don't, at least in Canada and in the States, it's interest rates are going up, and so everything else in the world goes up with it, including all the components, if you can find the components.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this brings us back to the point about being able to exit a cloud if need be. So if you're on NC2 and you're on whichever hyperscaler, and there's any form of commercial issue, with interest rates going up, the cost might increase or whatever, you can move quite easily. So for anyone listening, to architect a data center relocation is not an insignificant task. There's a lot involved with that if it's done correctly. If the person you're engaging to architect that migration knows what they're doing, you're probably going to be slightly frustrated in the length of time and detail they go to before they give you that migration strategy, because there's a lot to consider. If you rush that, your chance of issues is extremely high. So I don't recommend anyone rush a movement like that. So with these solutions, though, there's a lot less to consider. There's a lot less risk. The chance of success is extremely high. And also you can just test that migration very quickly as well. So keeping the virtual machine in a format that's portable, is so important. So cost of migrating out in tough economic times, which obviously, a lot of the world is in, the interest rates in Australia are going through the roof as well. So I think for US customers or Australian customers, same situation. There's an economic challenge. How can we deploy things in an efficient way? And if we're going to do it on-prem, how do we scale? Like, even with Nutanix, you add a node, it scales very nicely. But the constraint to me with all of these really good solutions is just getting the hardware. And then getting someone to plug it in. Like, that itself is not technically difficult, but
Oddly
getting kit in a timely manner can be difficult.
Oddly enough, the hyperscalers have some of the same problem. At least I think the one misconception is that the cloud is limitless, which could be further from the truth. Like, they still have just supply chain issues, but they kind of scurry around it by, well, one, they might make their own parts, but they also just buy in such a vast quantity that, numbers dictate there'll be servers somewhere, I guess. But
yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, I've certainly seen with multiple vendors that the cloud provider, the hyperscaler, actually didn't have the kit in the location the customer wanted to deploy it. So yeah, definitely when we're architecting a solution, even an NC2, which is very good, we want to make sure there's a mitigation to that. So if we want to deploy in say, Tokyo, and Tokyo doesn't have any resources, okay, how are we going to solve that problem? Where is our next location? And to your earlier point about preceding data, this is something I really like with hyperscalers, is the ability to precede data on lower cost storage and then rehydrate that, when needed. So that's not something you can really do on-prem. You can't just sort of have a data center somewhere that's very lightly built, right, and then seed some data. That you'd pretty much be building a DR site at full cost. Whereas in the hyperscalers, obviously, we can get economies of scale there. So, that to me is a huge advantage.
Yeah, actually, one thing that we did with Nutanix and the AWS side was offer heterogeneous support for node types, just because a node type could be out in a certain availability zone. So at least, if need be, you could grab the next node that's closest and, kind of carry on your merry way.
I remember the discussions well. So, yeah, heterogeneous obviously is great because you don't want to be constrained by one node type either. So, for those listening, if we have node type A and node type B, and node A was the right choice day one, and then we've gone through a journey and our apps have changed, scaled up or down, requirements have changed, being able to add a different bare metal instance to a cluster and then take out the other instances in a non-disruptive way is another huge value, because when we do sizing, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, the type of hardware can make a huge difference. So a lot of people like big, scale up nodes, which have got huge amounts of CPU and RAM. But when you have a distributed storage fabric like AOS, you actually want to scale out to get resiliency and efficiency benefits and performance benefits. So day one, you might only be able to use 3 big nodes for whatever reason. But soon thereafter, you might add 6 smaller nodes in and remove the 3 big nodes and actually have a better outcome from a technical and architectural perspective, and also get a better cost outcome. So I think that flexibility with NC2 is also very valuable because things do change. Whether you're in a hyperscaler or on-prem, things change. So yeah, that's a really great point. So NC2 also, or Nutanix recently announced about some multi-tenant capabilities. Can you give us a bit of background on that and where things are heading?
Are you referring to the networking side of the house? Yeah. So I think micro-segmentation, and then there's a virtual flow networking. So they've kind of can hit at 2 different spots. On the flow networking side, you can control policy-based routing within your own Nutanix VPC, and then on the micro segmentation side, using categories, you can distribute security policies to allow, block. I think probably the best part of that feature set, though, and it is actually yesterday when we were troubleshooting some Active Directory work in AWS, was that you could actually see the traffic flows, and then oh, that port's blocked, and then take a, screenshot the list, send it off to the network team and get the ports opened up. So even if you're not blocking anything, just the ability to see the traffic flow visually can make a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the visualizations Nutanix has provided over the years is really good. Definitely helps with troubleshooting. So yeah, I think that's a great point. So if you can talk a little bit about where the multi-tenancy capability might be heading in the future without breaking any rules.
Oh, I think the holy grail is just to have a workload that's mobile, but having the same security policies follow it. And today we can do that. You could mirror environments, but we do with our Nutanix validated designs. We've have scripts that you have to run after the migration, but I think that have it totally automated and also enforced would be kind of the next logical step in that evolution, right? Just how can and it really depends on the customer too. Some customers may want to fail, if my workload does not have this security policy, well, the sheer data is so important. I don't want that thing to come up without it, because attackers will actually induce failures to cause those situations. So you end up in, with your pants down, so to speak. And then they walk right in and take what they want and they're gone. It may sound like, the sacrificing availability, but it really depends on what the data is. So I think that's kind of the roadmap. That's a different department, but you kind of hear inklings of where that in the industry is going.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
It does make sense. So if there is a failure induced, you want to make sure that you are compliant and you know what's happening in those different failure scenarios. So that sounds quite exciting. I think keeping something secure and having it not come online if it can't be made secure, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I would say most companies, realistically, if not all, would want that setting to enforce security first, because the cost of ransomware and things like and data breaches is enormous. I literally got a speeding fine the other day because my license data was stolen in a data leak, and someone's trying to get away with a speeding fine.
how did they do that? That sounds that sounds horrible. How do you fight that?
It's easy to fight because obviously it wasn't my vehicle and I wasn't there at the time. But that's a really good example that just happened this week of if your car registration or your driver's license, your identification is effectively stolen, that you can have something happen like that. And obviously that's an inconvenience. I have to try and identify that and have that reversed. But if you're the company responsible for that outage, without naming names, obviously that's a pretty bad day, month, week, year. Yeah.
I just envision you on a show like Judge Judy trying to tell the judge that your identity was stolen and that it wasn't you speeding. You just don't envision it going very far.
Yeah. I tell you what, if it goes to court, I'll film it for you. I think they'll see this quite easily and resolve it. But that's just a good example. Like if your driver's license is stolen due to a data breach, and a lot of companies, we give out our identification, to our banks, real estate agents or, whoever. We give out our ID reasonably easily these days because everyone demands it. But if there is a data breach, the implication is pretty significant. So, yeah, security first.
I have a bad habit of buying things online from unreputable places because the deal's good. I thought I was burned once, and then like a month later after I bought it, the actual stuff showed up, but I'd canceled my credit card before then. But there are huge penalties for companies with data breaches. Not so much, I don't think, in North America. We're always kind of behind the game, but there will get worse. And so I think just like leaving it up to happen chance is not really going to be the way of IT.
Yeah, and I think even if there isn't a financial penalty from a regulatory organization, I think the loss of trust with customers is the key. If my business loses all our data or exposes people's private data, to the public, then no one's going to want to work with, that company. So to me, that's, primarily we want the customer to have a good experience. And if we're losing their data, or exposing it, that's a pretty bad experience. So even if there's no regulations, I still think customers would want, security first approaches. So, it's good that NC2 is taking that approach. And I think a lot of people who are nervous about going to a hyperscaler can be rest assured that there are settings like that help protect them.
Yeah, I think, even within the hypervisor today, there's automatic security checks, which, in case you've been or have an administrator that reverts something, at least it'll, depending on your settings, will go back and revert it to the last known good state around at least security. So there are different things, but I think you have to keep going up the stack, I guess, layer 7 and get it before it even gets to that point.
Yeah, I think so. One of the other things that I really like about having the hypervisor in the stack, whether it's on-prem or not, is you can protect things before it hits the machine. So if it's a physical server and a physical NIC, then the compromise is coming in and it's already on the box. Whereas in a hypervisor, you've got that extra layer of abstraction where you can potentially protect the virtual machine from an attack. So I think with a hypervisor, that is a valuable security measure, and not just performance and not just cost optimization and all the other great things virtualization does. I think adding that layer of abstraction gives you another place where you can protect. And protecting at the virtual layer is much better than the physical layer, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think just the power of automation. It's hard to unplug the network cable, but it's pretty easy to write an API call and remove the NIC from being connected altogether. I guess that's poor man's micro segmentation. You just disconnect everything, fixed. But yeah, you're right. There's just a lot more options on how you want to tackle the problem.
I mean, air gapping is no joke. Like, if you believe you're being compromised, you need to be able to disconnect to try and mitigate that damage. So being able to do that virtually instead of physically would be step one. Bang, just isolate your environment. Most administrators would have remote access to their environment and be able to do that. And then obviously have disconnected themselves from the environment as well at that point. But then when you go into the data center, you can then start to investigate these issues. So
that is kind of one architectural thing that they always recommend at the hyperscalers to, different services, put them in their own networking constructs, but it doesn't happen as often as you would probably want or like because of network challenges. So I guess there's probably huge opportunity in that space as well. And then that problem goes 100 times worse when you start connecting clouds that have totally different constructs. And there's a couple companies that I've seen that are trying to close the gap, but there's probably I guess security companies, I would say, are probably like there's tons of them all doing sorts of different things, but then like the network security is probably still, it hasn't been as touched, I guess.
Yeah, I think functionality of solutions comes first, and then security comes somewhere down the road, which is obviously not ideal, but for sure there's a gap to be filled. So overall, yeah, we've talked a lot about this hyperscaler and hypervisor model. What are you seeing from a success perspective? What sort of problems have you seen solved with this solution with NC2?
A lot on DR, as far as elastic DR, starting small, at least having your important virtual machines the ability to spin up quickly with near sync. So somewhere between 1 to 15 minutes RPO, assuming your on-prem data center can has the latency to do that. And then if you have the extra storage, that's when you can land your other workloads there. And then in the event of a failure, add nodes on demand, whether you want to go into the NC2 portal and hit add node, or, just scale it up by looking at the cluster CPU, and then you could easily auto script that to happen. That's probably the biggest one. We do have some cloud first customers that have their environments up and running, doing test dev. Just as there's a way to kind of have a known state and shut it down after the fact and get everything back when the fact that your instance actually doesn't totally get blown away. And then I guess just migrations in general, but
yeah, have you got like a favorite customer? Obviously, don't name the customer, but a favorite deployment that you thought was really cool, whether it was the scale or whether it was solving a specific problem or whether it was an app that just performance went through the roof because you've put it on NC2?
I think the favorite customer, and like your favorite customers are also the ones that gave you the most headaches because just because of their sheer scale that you learned some things along the way. And so I think the multi-region deployments where they're truly using the world, like the hyperscalers locations to their advantage because there's just a lot of working pieces that need to be put in place. In this case, it was a virtual desktops deployment that were all bare bones setups through multiple data centers that were just they were all ready to scale up when needed. So that was really tested because the testing went from 3 nodes to 24 nodes and up to I think 28 and like multiple spots. And I think like typical enterprise infrastructure does not scale up and scale down repeatedly. It's usually like a one-time thing, and you may be able to go back, but it's not like a yo-yo. And so and the big benefit I think to that is that all of those learnings also got into the on-prem product. So that would be the bestest.
The bestest. I love it. I don't know if that's a Canadian thing or an Australian thing.
No, that's probably just a Dwayneism. I tell people that, like when you meet someone that speaks multiple languages, I always feel like a moron because I say I barely know one language. So I'm still here. Just, I know QWERTY, the QWERTY keyboard. That's my language.
That's about all I know as well. So where are we going to go from here? So from an architecture perspective, so what I found interesting while I was at Nutanix and subsequently, it's the same, regardless of your employer, is customers want to obviously reduce cost up front. So there's a lot of options with Nutanix and other solutions where you can sort of compromise things in your sizing in order to get fewer nodes. My favorite example is people don't want to have N+1 because it's seen as a cost or a waste because you're not using the resource. What are your thoughts on that? I think you know mine, so I'll share mine after you.
Oh yeah, I think most where that really rears its heads is like in competitive situations where I guess it can happen on both sides, but definitely skim a node here, skim some storage here, and then months after the deployment, it's like it hits the proverbial fan. It's horrible and it does happen. But I think at least in the cloud side, a lot of your N+1, at least your spare node is like always there in theory. Like you're always going to have the next good node available. That doesn't stop you from proper N+1 because you need a spot to rebuild the data, and then also timings. But you get a little bit more wiggle room on being stingy in that environment, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So at least in the cloud, the hardware is more than likely going to be available when a failure occurs to be put back into the cluster, and an NC2 cluster scales, adds a node, sub 1 hour. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. But I think what people need to understand is the node being added doesn't resolve the problem. It's after the node's added and the data is resynchronized that at that point, after resynchronization, is where the cluster becomes fully resilient again. So, if you want to talk about the time to getting back to a resilient state or a compliant state with whatever your storage policies are, is the time it takes to add the hardware, which in the cloud it may be even automated, like with NC2, but then the data actually being reprotected as well. So if we're protecting 20 terabytes of data, that might take an hour as well. So we're really talking about a risk window of, say, 2 hours in this example. And customers need to be aware that if a subsequent failure happened during that 2 hours, there might be degradation or downtime, depending on their configuration. So I think sizing in a hyperscaler, I agree, there's a bit more wiggle room. But if we're sizing on-prem and you're waiting for a physical piece of hardware to be delivered or replaced or serviced, I don't think I've ever actually, hand on heart, seen a 4-hour hardware replacement warranty actually be replaced in 4 hours. And I've seen them sold many times. And I wrote a blog a few years ago that if you have a well-sized HCI solution, that the requirement for a hardware replacement contract that's like 4 hours or 8 hours is really minimal to none because it will self-heal. If you've got an N+1 environment, it'll self-heal to a resilient state, and then it'll be able to tolerate one more failure. And then, sure enough, it's in a degraded state, but it's still online. In the cloud, a bit more flexibility, but the concept still applies that we can't assume that there's hardware available in the cloud, even though there more than likely will be. So, that's one thing. And then if there's not hardware available in that location, and the hyperscaler tells you it'll be a week before it comes, you're at risk now for an extended period. What's your mitigation to that scenario? Because I've certainly seen that before. And I've also seen the scenario where customers have tried to scale up and the hardware type has not been available. So NC2 has mitigated that somewhat with the heterogeneous nodes, which is great. But I think architecting for resiliency in a hyperscaler, there's still very similar considerations to on-prem. It's just arguably probably a little bit quicker to recover.
And I guess even be aware on numbers and do your testing, I guess, accordingly, because adding nodes when the load is light and versus adding nodes when the cluster is already under pressure. I was just actually we're updating our validated design for our hybrid cloud that's doing VR, and it's like failover nodes, but while that failover is happening, adding the nodes while it's happening, and then adding the rest of the VMs that need those nodes. And it's like making sure that it works. Actually, the adding nodes in AWS I added 2 nodes and it was just over 20 minutes to add them. But then, removing them from the cluster took about an hour because the cluster was under load and also trying to self-heal. So, these things matter when you're facing issues.
Yeah, and I think the key, people might be frustrated with the delay it takes to add a node and migrate the data or remove a node because of that data migration process. But this is maintaining your data integrity. So this is not a bad thing. So we could remove a node immediately and have the entire cluster in a degraded state, but that would put a customer at a risk. So we definitely wouldn't want to do that. So yeah, for those listening who might not understand why it takes 4 hours to remove a node from a cluster, it's because the entire data set has to be moved off and done so in a resilient state. So it's a good thing to have that delay. Is the multi-node removal supported in NC2 or is that still just on-prem?
No, it's supported in AWS, and a part of that big customer I mentioned was definitely the push to get that out.
Yeah, fantastic. So multi-node removal, for those who haven't heard of it, it's basically the ability for multiple nodes within the cluster on-prem or in NC2 to move the data off so they can be removed. So if you were doing a big burst from 6 nodes to 20 nodes or something, you're not waiting one at a time for them to be removed, which is how it used to work. And Nutanix is pretty good with the data evacuation from nodes. So that process is reasonably fast. But to Dwayne's point, if your cluster is under heavy load, then there's only a certain amount of performance hardware can provide. So if you're moving a huge amount of data off while you're trying to service users, then there's a compromise there. The performance might come down a little bit and the evacuation might be throttled and take a bit longer. But certainly administratively, it's very easy. You just click all the nodes to remove and eventually they're gone.
I think the interesting part with how we handled multi-node removal, though, was the ability to mark the nodes, because what you don't want to happen if say you have a 10-node cluster and you're removing 4 of them, you've bursted your workload's fine and you're removing them. You do not want to move the same piece of data 4 times, because that could happen, right? You move it off node 1, it goes to node 2, then you remove node 2. And so then it really takes a long time to remove multiple nodes. So
absolutely. And that was literally the constraint with removing things single node at a time was, if you're removing node 8, 9, and 10, as you remove node 10, it's going to 8 and 9 because it's distributing, nicely throughout the cluster. But marking them avoids that issue. So absolutely, that's a really good, efficient way of removing hardware. So yeah, implementation matters, people, not marketing. Implementation.
Yeah, you need to see it in action.
Yeah, and test as well. I remember doing testing, scaling NC2 up to above the supported limits, and removing nodes one at a time was frustrating because I could see the bill, and when the bill came, of course, my manager at the time was like, "Ooh, you spent a lot of money." Well, let's get multi-node removal happening. So there's like a real-world example of even when doing testing, multi-node removal is a valuable feature to save.
Sometimes you just need to supply the necessary motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, Nutanix has done a great job with that multi-node removal. It's a feature I certainly championed for a while because it's, especially in NC2, it's huge value.
It's funny. I totally forgot about it altogether. It's just kind of, you take things for granted after a while, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great feature. And like you say, the way it works with marking the nodes is really good. That's a detail that's, obviously someone like Minosis has probably come up with and made sure it was done well. Minosis is the CTO at Nutanix for those listening. So very cool. So where do you see NC2 going from here? Apart from extremely successfully and delivering a lot of great outcomes, what do you think's going to be next?
Next on the horizon for NC2, I think it's maybe possible other cloud providers. I guess with that being said, there's tons of non-hyperscaler cloud providers that you could also kind of deploy your Nutanix build into. I think
maybe tell us about that. Tell us what that means, because I think most people listening wouldn't. You and I know what we're talking about, but for the listeners, what is that?
Yeah, so there's other cloud providers that offer bare metal services, and with that you can. They vary. I think the one lately that I've done work with is OVH Cloud, and super cost effective. I think if you went and checked them out, you'd be happy with what your bill would be, but not quite as dynamic. So if you had more of a known quantity, I think they're like the perfect fit if you're looking to get outside of your data center. But so
that's probably your preference, where they're moving on-prem into something like that as opposed to just a hyperscaler.
Mm-hmm. And then there's I always goof up on the name when I say it, because there's another company, Equinox. They offer a bare metal service too, but I would say their value add is that they have great networking connectivity, a lot of financial providers. So if you're looking to eke out the best on that side, like maybe you're running something in the stock world, they might be your preferred choice. So it's there's all of these different providers that have their own niche that may be the perfect fit for you.
Yeah, fantastic. So basically, NC2 is not really just solving in hyperscalers. It's solving customers who really want on-prem but don't want to manage the physical data center, because those solutions offer the bare metal and offer a lot of that infrastructure without going to a hyperscaler. So that sounds like a pretty good option to me for quite a lot of customers.
Yeah, they probably don't get the marketing they deserve, but definitely they have a lot of benefits.
Have you seen any customers go from a hyperscaler back to one of these bare metal companies?
I can't think of one, honestly, off the top of my head. I've seen lots going from on-prem to the bare metal, but I'd have to follow up, to be honest. I'm just
curious. I think some customers, that might be a really valid exit strategy. You don't want to go back to on-prem and manage it all yourself. And if you don't want to be with one of the hyperscalers, that would be an easy transition, because effectively, we've still got the same layer. The NC2 layer is across all those environments. So moving data there is quite quick and easy. So yeah, I think that's a good exit strategy for CIOs and architects to consider.
No, I think it even might just a hybrid approach of, depending on where you figure out where you want to land, cost per service might make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I think if customers went all in with that NC2 approach, then and they weren't using cloud native, then some of these bare metal environments may be perfect replacements for on-prem. Um, you're getting some of the benefits of a hyperscaler without going to a hyperscaler. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, on the cloud native side, when you mentioned that, it made me think that Nutanix has changed a bit of the direction around that. I just think there's a bit more focus on data services on the cloud native side, which super happy to hear, because I think we should have probably been more focused there as a strength anyway, and let some of the Red Hats of the world control, be the value added partner on that, because they're like customers. Well, I guess once you have a CSI driver, it doesn't really matter that much, but it just allows us to be a bit more open without sinking a ton of engineering into something that may or may not meet the needs. Because you can run Kubernetes on Nutanix in different flavors, so and then you kind of get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
So
I was just jibber jabbering on that and forgot the rest of the question.
it's okay. I was going to say, you touched on a good point that, for developers who want to use Kubernetes and they might go, I don't want to use Nutanix or virtualization or whatever. Well, it's, a standard. I always used to say Nutanix is like a standard platform for all workloads, whether it's a VDI or a business critical app, general server. And with the support of Kubernetes, I think that's a good value as well. So they can be in a cloud provider, getting all the benefits of a hyperscaler, maintaining it on Nutanix so that they've got that portability and standardization and cost efficiency, and still do containers. So to me, it's kind of a best of all worlds at that point.
If you're doing something that's worthwhile, there's typically going to be some type of data involved, and the money is who controls, how do you control the data for better uses? And so that's one, the ability, like if you have this driver or this where you can load Kubernetes data to, and then replicate it and bring it up, along with, obviously containers can blow up and come back, but you still need the data. But then, like, one of the biggest announcements at .next this last year was around multi-cloud snapshots, which is just the ability of taking Nutanix snapshots and getting them into the public cloud, whether that's S3. I guess S3 is the first one to go. And then, so like if you're looking down the road, okay, well now I can put Nutanix snapshots directly into the public cloud. What's the next thing that's going to happen? I don't know what the next thing is, but it's like as long as you can get the data from point A to point B, you have a fighting chance of enabling the next thing. So that's what I find interesting with any of the new technologies, because even who knows how long stuff will end, but the data remains.
Yeah, and making the data accessible in as many formats as possible, I think, is key. So I think at the .next event in Chicago, Project Beacon was talked about. Can you share what Project Beacon is, at least publicly, and what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm gonna take a pass. I'm kind of in the spot where I don't know what is forbidden fruit or not, so I'm just gonna.
Oh, very good. Well, let's err on the side of caution then. I think you touched on it already. That it's looking at, from my outside perspective, it's looking at data, providing it natively in the hyperscalers, and providing options from there. So yeah, I think it's an exciting space, and we'll probably hear more about Project Beacon as we go. I was at one of the Nutanix roadshows the other day where they talked to it. So it sounds like there's some cool stuff potentially coming.
I've been hidden away in my Canadian cave. I'm going to be traveling for like the first time in like 3.5 years next month. So I guess
wow.
Next month.
Yeah, you get some sun. I need some sun, clearly, but.
Well, I'm not in best lighting. I've actually, as mentioned before the call, my service provider back home couldn't come and fix it until Monday. So I went to the lake, ironically, that has a better internet connection with Starlink.
There you go. So yeah. Tesla fan.
Big fan of the space program. Anyway, I don't. Not too many charging stations where I live.
Yeah, fair enough. And plugging into an outlet's pretty slow. No, I'm lucky. I live in metropolitan Melbourne, so there's plenty of charging for me, including one in the building I live in. So that's very convenient.
I actually did see. I was helping a lake neighbor put their dock in, and I saw a Tesla plugged in. So they had a wired-in charger, but there's not too many of them around.
Yeah. Yeah. But I tell you what's really good in the cold, not that Melbourne gets super cold, is the ability to warm your car up from your phone before you get in it. So I'm not sure at what age I started feeling the cold, because I never used to feel the cold. But at a certain age, I think it was post-COVID, I was quite sick with COVID. Now I feel the cold. So I'm always rugged up now. So the heater's on, and I'm in a T-shirt for the podcast. But it's very cold outside, and it's nice and toasty in here. So that's good for me.
I guess you are going through your winter phase.
Yeah, exactly. So that's really good. So I guess we'll wrap up here. Do you have any closing thoughts on NC2 and just the industry in general with the hyperscalers and hypervisor model and things like that?
I think my closing statements would be any app anywhere is how I would think of NC2 just being an extension. I think whether you use that service or not, I think as a company, you wouldn't select Nutanix if we didn't have that service, because it is the get out of jail card that you could use for a lot of situations, regardless if you're using it full time or it's just there for the ransomware, deploy a new cluster and bring something back. So I think it's just, add it to the menu card. Today it's an option, and in the future it'll be a requirement that people will ask for.
I love it, actually. Get out of jail free card. I think that, to me, sums up hyperscaler and hypervisor model products. Is they are a get out of jail free card because it gives you the most options and flexibility to get in or out of an environment, migrate, DR, ransomware, whatever. So I think that's a great place to end off, and I'm going to quote you on that in future podcasts and tweets and the like. So thank you for that.
Sounds great, and thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Brian. It's good to see you, and hope things are well. And we'll speak again soon.
Next time I come to the lake, I'll bring my ring light. So thanks for having me.
Perfect. You're not like me. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Dwayne.
Have a good one.